Trump goes off. After Jasmine Crockett exposes Karoline Leavitt's secret dealings live on CNN. The red light blinked once, then twice, then it stayed on. From CNN's Washington studio, the air didn't feel like television. It felt like judgment. The lights were cold, the table was glass, and across it 2 women sat like history preparing to unfold its spine. Jake Tapper didn't smile. Not the full one, not even the half one he offers when introducing contentious guests. Tonight there was no cushion in his voice, just precision. Good evening. We begin tonight with a number. 32 million. That's the alleged count of deceased Americans who, according to the Trump campaign, are still receiving government benefits. If true, it's a national scandal. If false, it may be the newest weapon in a war where truth has no home. He didn't pause for drama. The silence did that on its own. The camera panned, slowly catching the flicker in Karoline Leavitt's smile. Hair pulled back, jacket immaculate, eyes trained. Across from her, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, still unblinking hands folded like someone preparing to testify not to opinion, but to memory. This isn't just politics, Tapper continued, voice now, a low pulse. Tonight on Truth in the Fire, we ask, is the Trump administration's push against alleged welfare fraud a quest for transparency or a performance cloaked in urgency designed to dominate headlines and delete nuance? He turned toward the 2 women. Miss Leavitt, you have 3 minutes. Karoline nodded with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this speech not just with aides but with algorithms. Her voice was polished, crisp, empty of doubt. Or air. Thank you, CNN, for hosting this. Let me be clear from the start. I'm not here tonight to win points. I'm here to tell the truth, a truth the mainstream media has refused to examine. Our social security system is being exploited, repeatedly, systematically. And it's not a partisan theory. It's an ongoing statistical crisis. Preliminary analysis shows upwards of 30 million potentially fraudulent benefit accounts, many of them tied to recipients who are frankly no longer living. She let that sentence settle, like ash. President Trump, she said, adjusting a folder she didn't open, has initiated a task force of independent analysts to investigate. This includes innovators like Elon Musk, people who aren't shackled by bureaucracy but driven by solutions. This isn't about politics, it's about performance, fiscal performance, ethical performance, governmental accountability. Tapper did not nod. He simply looked. Karoline pressed forward. If that makes some people uncomfortable, maybe it's because the truth rarely flatters those who rely on illusion. She ended her time not with a smile, but with a head tilt, a gesture that could have come from a courtroom litigator or a stage actor who knew the next line belonged to someone else. Tapper looked toward Jasmine. She didn't speak right away. The camera waited, America waited, and then Jasmine exhaled. Not to calm herself, to clear space, to call what we just heard truth is to give language permission to abandon its spine, she said quietly. But if truth had shape, it would be trembling right now, crushed beneath what was just presented as fact. The studio didn't move. Crockett leaned in, not forward, inward, like someone unsheathing gravity. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I know what evidence looks like. I know what spin sounds like. And I know what happens when fear is packaged with a barcode and handed to a billionaire under the label of reform. She didn't blink. This so-called 32 million number, no independent verification, no cross-agency list, no accountability, no process, just a headline, just a myth. And now that myth has been licensed to someone who doesn't answer to Congress, doesn't swear an oath, doesn't submit to the Freedom of Information Act. He writes code, not law. She turned not to Karoline, to the camera. If a stranger knocked on your door and said, "Hand me your life savings so I can double-check who's cheating you," would you do it? Then why are we handing our entire federal welfare infrastructure, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, to someone entirely outside of democratic oversight? The lights didn't shift, but the energy did. Even Tapper moved, slightly. I just came back from South Dallas. Crockett continued, voice steady. Met a 74-year-old woman living off $216 a month. That comes from LIHEAP, the Low-Income Energy Assistance Program. If that gets cut because of some billionaire's data dashboard, she will have to choose her electric bill or her blood pressure meds. Crockett turned now, finally, to Karoline. The look wasn't anger, it was clarity. You say this isn't political, but every word you've uttered tonight is politics wearing the mask of reform. And when you cut programs with clinical words like audit and realignment, people don't just lose benefits. They lose warmth, they lose food, they lose breath. The glass table did not rattle, but it felt like it should have. Karoline did not interrupt, but her fingers twitched once. Crockett didn't flinch. When you describe survival as inefficiency, you are not saving America. You are selling it back to itself in pieces. Tapper looked down at his cards, then set them aside. Jasmine's voice dropped. You call this oversight. But what I see, what millions watching see, is control dressed as concern. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Let's measure then. Measure how many miles a disabled veteran has to walk when a food assistance office is relocated out of his zip code. Measure how long a single mother waits for Medicaid approval while her child burns with fever at 2 a.m. Measure the anxiety of a 7-year-old child when their school lunch program disappears for efficiency review. The studio didn't gasp, it contracted. President Trump's campaign, she said, with a stillness that felt sacred, has embraced words like streamline, audit, refactor. But the communities they affect, they don't live in spreadsheets. They live in grocery lines, bus stops, empty medicine bottles. The red light on the camera was still on. So was the nation. Jake Tapper finally spoke. What we're watching may not be a debate. It may be a demonstration. He looked into the lens. His words landed like a gavel made of air. 2 fluencies. One speaks the language of metrics, the other the language of consequence. The screen didn't fade. The silence spoke first. The silence didn't just hang. It stayed. Like a verdict without a voice. Like the weight of something unarguable just not yet said aloud. Jake Tapper didn't fill the space. He let it linger. That was the difference between a host and a witness. Tonight he was both. Karoline Leavitt adjusted a page that didn't need adjusting, her lips pressed together. The calculation had returned, but something behind the eyes had shifted, something that new metrics had just met memory and flinched. She leaned forward, not for warmth, for control. Congresswoman Crockett is a skilled speaker, Karoline began. And she's absolutely right about one thing: this issue matters, which is why we can't afford to let feelings replace facts. Her voice was firmer now, armored in procedural cadence. Yes, the Trump administration is working with Elon Musk, because while Congress drags its heels with bureaucracy and hearings, he builds. While some debate whether fraud exists, he designs detection protocols. You don't fight 30 million cases of possible abuse with paper memos. You fight it with innovation. She looked into the lens, the voice of a campaign not yet aware it had begun losing the room. President Trump doesn't believe in red tape. He believes in results. And the only way to restore trust in this country is to verify where every tax dollar goes. If that means discomfort for the political class, so be it. Tapper didn't move. Crockett didn't blink. But somewhere just under the camera's peripheral vision, someone in the control room exhaled audibly, then turned off their mic. Karoline continued. Let me be clear, we are not targeting the poor. We are targeting the broken systems that claim to serve them, but are riddled with loopholes. She paused, just long enough to sound thoughtful. The president doesn't apologize for putting American taxpayers first. Crockett didn't respond right away. She leaned back, not in retreat, but in readiness. Then her voice returned low and leveled like a moral scalpel. Innovation, she repeated. That word sounds good. Until it arrives at your door without explanation and starts rewriting your bills. Her hands remained folded. Elon Musk doesn't answer to Congress. He doesn't file reports to the Office of the Inspector General. He doesn't operate under FOIA, the Federal Records Act, or the Privacy Act of 1974. She turned slightly this time to Tapper. You know what that means? It means if tomorrow someone is wrongfully flagged by this task force, there is no court to appeal to. No legal standard, no procedural recourse. Just an algorithm built in private by a billionaire who has never waited in a benefits line. Her voice tightened, but not in volume, in purpose. This isn't reform, it's privatized governance. She let the weight sit. You know what I see, Jake? She asked calmly. I see a sitting president outsourcing surveillance of the American poor to a man who once said AI would save humanity, but also built the most invasive data mining empire on Earth. Tapper's eyes narrowed, not in opposition, but recognition. Crockett wasn't done. And for the record, Ms. Leavitt, I didn't replace facts with feelings. I replaced spin with stakes. You talked about systems. I talked about people. You brought a dashboard. I brought a life. The phrase didn't echo. It didn't need to. Because you cannot audit a grandmother's grief, and you cannot streamline a child's hunger. A long pause. Then, the truth doesn't live in code. It lives in the silence between what we're told is efficient and what is actually humane. Karoline's face tightened, then recovered. The instinct to counter returned. But Tapper spoke first. "Congresswoman Crockett," he asked, voice even, "do you believe President Trump is deliberately misleading the public with this investigation?" Crockett's reply came slowly, not evasive, intentional. "I think this administration is using language as a weapon, and silence as a shield." She turned her head not to Tapper, not to Leavitt, to the camera, to those watching at home who may feel afraid, who may worry they're next. "I see you. I see your medication bottles lined up beside your heating bill. I see the unopened envelopes because you know what they contain and can't afford to respond." Tapper said nothing. He just let her keep going. "I see the single mom trying to decide whether to buy groceries or keep the car running long enough to get to work. I see the veteran walking 6 miles because his benefits office merged with another district and no one told him the bus route vanished with it." She didn't raise her voice, but the room leaned closer. "This administration keeps using words like redesign, optimize, realign. I've sat in those hearings. I've read the footnotes. I know what those words mean." Her next line came like a gavel, not raised but final. Redesign meant 2 bus lines vanished from South Dallas, and 300 seniors were suddenly 3 miles from the nearest pharmacy. She turned back to Karoline, her voice now surgical. "In your world, that's net efficiency. In mine, it's missed medication and risked lives." The studio held its breath. Karoline didn't speak. Jake Tapper broke the silence carefully. "What you're describing, Congresswoman, sounds less like a policy debate and more like a reckoning." Crockett nodded once. "No one survives on PowerPoint. They survive on policy that arrives, on time, in the mail, before winter." The red light was still on. And in the control room, a producer scribbled on a post-it note and slid it to the executive director. "She's not arguing. She's witnessing. And America was too. She's not arguing. She's witnessing." The note sat at the edge of the director's console under a trembling index finger. No one moved to remove it. No one looked away from the screen. Back in the studio, the silence was breathing now, steady, heavy, undeniable. It wasn't just filling space, it was shaping it. Karoline Leavitt leaned back slightly, not in surrender, but in calculation. She wasn't defeated, not yet. But the edges of her message had begun to blur, and she knew it. The bullet points in her mind no longer landed as conviction. They felt like choreography out of sync with the music. She pressed forward anyway. "You speak with power, Congresswoman," she said, keeping her voice even, "but the American people deserve more than poetic grief. They deserve solutions. And President Trump has never been afraid to find them in unconventional places." The phrase hung for a moment, just long enough to be questioned by its own echo. "Elon Musk," she continued, "has built a global satellite network, revolutionized electric vehicles, constructed payment systems used across continents. Are we really supposed to believe that applying his innovation to government systems is dangerous just because he's not an elected official?" She straightened her notes even though she hadn't looked down at them once. "This administration isn't outsourcing democracy. We're upgrading it." Tapper glanced sideways, eyebrows raised, not mocking, not surprised, just noting. A man who'd seen every form of spin now watching a new variant repackage disruption as reform. Karoline wasn't done. Americans are tired of being told that change is betrayal. They want speed. They want clarity. They want leaders who aren't afraid to cut through layers of government tape and just fix what's broken. Crockett's hands remained folded, but her gaze was surgical. "Let me ask you, Karoline," she said slowly, "do you believe democracy should be measured in metrics or in access?" Leavitt blinked. Crockett pressed forward, not fast, not loud, but with the slow force of something irreversible. "Because I sat in an oversight committee last month and reviewed a memo stamped urgent, a Trump administration pilot program to consolidate benefit approval centers under a new data efficiency model." Her fingers tapped once on the glass table. That model on paper reduced processing times. It looked good, tight, minimal, efficient. She paused, but buried in the appendix page, 47 line 19, was a phrase service void risk zones to be monitored quarterly. You know what that meant. She looked up, not waiting for an answer. 6,000 people across 3 southern counties suddenly had no office within walking distance. No one called them. No one translated the letter. Their paperwork expired. Their medications lapsed. Their electricity shut off. The camera cut slowly, capturing the absence of reaction on Leavitt's face. Because in the language of spreadsheets, Crockett continued, they became a margin of error. She leaned in now, not to dominate, but to reveal. In this administration's vocabulary, when access becomes a liability, it gets redesigned. Karoline sat still. Her jaw had tensed. Her eyes flickered toward Tapper, perhaps hoping for an interjection. None came. Redesign Crockett repeated her voice, flattening. That word shows up in fiscal memos and budget rollbacks. That word replaces people with line items. That word deletes humans from their own needs. Tapper finally spoke, low, calm. You're saying the rhetoric of reform is being used as a cloak. Crockett didn't nod. She didn't need to. I'm saying the language of engineering is being used to engineer silence. She turned back to Karoline. You say Musk moves fast. That's true. But there are people who move slow because their knees gave out, or their bus route vanished, or the only clinic with their records shut down and was replaced by a number they can't call because the phone tree is in English only. The studio didn't make a sound. And for those people, she said, your version of government is not reform. It's exile. Leavitt breathed in. Her voice returned slightly stiffer. The system needs oversight. You've admitted that. True oversight. Crockett interrupted gently. Happens under oath, not under code. That line hit like a needle to the nerve. Quiet, precise, paralyzing. Karoline blinked. Tapper looked straight ahead. Crockett adjusted nothing, just kept going. When you hand over sensitive federal data to someone who has built an empire out of unregulated user metrics, you're not auditing systems. You're selling sovereignty. She paused. When Elon Musk sees a problem, he writes code. When I see one, I write policy. One is bound by user terms. The other is bound by the Constitution. The red light on the camera stayed on. The nation was still watching, and Crockett was still composed. Democracy doesn't fail in explosions. It fails in revisions. Karoline inhaled through her nose. Her voice returned firm. So, what do you suggest? That we do nothing? That we keep paying the dead and letting fraud siphon billions from those who actually need help? No, Crockett said. She placed both palms flat on the table. I suggest we protect the system by serving the people in it. That we don't diagnose poverty as a glitch and we don't call inequality a feature. She sat still. Do I believe fraud exists? Yes. I've prosecuted it, I've defended it, I've seen it. But you don't use fire to cure a fever. Leavitt tilted her head. And you don't cure a system. Crockett continued by giving its pulse to someone who doesn't even believe in the body. Jake Tapper leaned forward slightly, not to cut in, but to listen. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't as a moderator. It was as a mirror. Tonight, the real debate may not be about fraud or reform, he said quietly. It's about something deeper. He turned to the camera. It's about whether American leadership still knows the difference between data and dignity. And for the first time in the entire segment, neither woman said a word, because dignity doesn't respond, it stands. But across the table, Karoline Leavitt did not stand. She didn't need to. Her role tonight was not to retreat, it was to recalibrate. She leaned in just enough to be seen but not challenged. Her posture shifted less campaign trail, more combat zone. What she had left wasn't argument, it was armor. I'm glad you brought up dignity. She began each syllable shaped with deliberate restraint. Because that's exactly what this administration is trying to restore. Not just to policy, but to the people who play by the rules, who pay into a system and expect it to function. Her voice was smooth now, almost softened. But behind the calm was steel. President Trump believes in that kind of dignity. The kind built from work, from grit, from order. And if we are bold enough to admit the system is broken, then we must also be bold enough to fix it, even if that fix doesn't look like the past. Crockett didn't move. She watched. Karoline continued. Some people call that dangerous. I call it different. And frankly, I think Americans are ready for different. There it was, again, the reframing of control, as innovation of privatization, as progress. She pivoted. You say Elon Musk doesn't answer to Congress, that he hasn't sworn an oath. That's true. But let me ask, have any of you walked into a government office lately, waited 6 months for a basic ID renewal, filled out a form just to get another form? That's the speed of our current system. She turned to the camera, now voice measured, hand flat on the table. Elon Musk doesn't wait for permission to fix things. He sees a problem, he acts, he builds, a beat, and sometimes the best people to save a system are the ones who never needed it. Crockett blinked once, not in confusion, in recognition. The moment had arrived. She placed one hand on the table fingers, tracing the edge of a folded slip of paper. It hadn't been visible before. Now it was. She didn't open it? Not yet. You said something, Crockett said softly. The best people to save a system are the ones who never needed it. She looked up. Her eyes didn't flash. They anchored. I want you to think about that sentence. She let it sit, then opened the paper quietly. It was a letter, handwritten. The creases were deep worn from being folded and refolded, handled, wept over. She read, "Dear Congresswoman Crockett, my name is Bernice Holloway. I am 74 years old. My husband fought in Korea. My son worked sanitation until his legs gave out. We've lived in the same house for 41 years. Last month I got a letter from a new review task force saying my benefits were under investigation. I don't know what I did wrong. I don't know who they are. But my heating bill went unpaid this month because I couldn't risk the deduction. I sit in the dark now. I wait." She folded the letter again. This woman, Crockett said, never missed a vote. She raised 2 sons, buried 1, and now she waits. Not for justice, for paperwork. She looked at Karoline. That's who gets caught in the gears when billionaires build algorithms without knowing the names behind the numbers. She placed the letter down. When Musk builds a satellite, he sees terrain. When I visit my constituents, I see terrain too. But mine has names, children, prescriptions. Grandmothers in coats indoors because they're afraid to turn the heat on. Karoline didn't speak. Tapper didn't move. The cameras stayed still. Crockett went on. You talked about Elon Musk's genius, his achievements, his refusal to wait. She nodded. You're right. He doesn't wait. He acts, he moves. But let me tell you what I saw 2 weeks ago in East Fort Worth. She folded her hands again. I met a girl, 8 years old. Her name is Ava. Her mother's been waiting 3 months for a Medicaid approval letter so she can get Ava a new asthma inhaler. Ava sleeps upright in a chair because when she lies flat she can't breathe. A pause. I asked her what she wanted to be when she grows up. Another pause. She said, a person who doesn't wait anymore. The silence dropped into the room like a closing door. Karoline shifted subtle a flicker of something unguarded. Tapper whispered, Congresswoman, but Crockett wasn't finished. This is not about whether Musk is smart. He is. This isn't about whether fraud exists. It does. This is about one question: who do we trust to protect the vulnerable? Someone who's never been vulnerable, or someone who still feels the weight of it every morning. Her hands moved from the letter. To trust someone with the keys to our systems, they have to know what it feels like when the locks don't open. The camera pulled back slightly. The moment was contracting not in power, but in precision, like a breath drawn before the final sentence. Karoline finally spoke. If we don't do something now, she said, voice clipped, we risk collapse. These systems are unsustainable. We can't throw money at problems and expect solutions. Crockett nodded once. I agree. Karoline looked startled. Crockett continued. We shouldn't throw money. We should place it, with intention, with care, with names written on every dollar. She leaned in, eyes forward. Because you're right, these systems can't survive without change. But what you're proposing isn't change, it's surrender. Karoline opened her mouth, but Tapper lifted one hand not to silence, but to conclude. I want to thank both of you, he said quietly, for what has clearly become something more than a discussion. It's a choice laid bare. He turned to the camera. The question may no longer be, who is right? The question may now be, who still sees the people behind the policy? The red light on the camera stayed on, and somewhere, Ava slept upright, waiting, and across the nation, millions watched a CNN broadcast that no longer felt like television. It felt like reflection, a nation mid-mirror, a government on trial not by the courts but by consequence. The studio lights hadn't changed, but the temperature had. Not warmer, not colder, just heavier. Jake Tapper glanced down at his desk, then back to the camera. His voice returned with the reverence of someone speaking not to ratings, but to record. We've talked tonight about oversight and innovation, about access and data. But as the conversation deepens, so too does the gravity of what's at stake. Then it happened. One of the floor producer's phones buzzed twice. She turned it over, frowned, and slipped it to the director. A short message glowed across the screen. Truth Social, 10:42 p.m. EST President Donald J. Trump. Jasmine Crockett is a lying lunatic radical, left nobody. She should be investigated for her own files. Lee Shi is a scam just like her. The message took 4 seconds to reach the control room, 6 seconds to reach Twitter, 10 seconds to reach every phone in the press box. And 20 seconds later, Jake Tapper looked up. The sitting president of the United States, he said, voice now razor flat, has just issued a personal attack on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Not a rebuttal, not a counterpoint, but a smear on live air. The room didn't move because smear wasn't the story. Timing was. This wasn't reactive, this was preloaded. Karoline Leavitt stiffened subtly, a flicker in her jaw. She hadn't seen the message yet, but she knew what had landed. Her eyes darted briefly to the floor monitor. Tapper remained stone still. We're not offering commentary on the president's post, he said, but both guests here tonight are invited to respond. He turned. Congresswoman Crockett, would you like the floor? She didn't answer immediately. Her hands remained still. She wasn't rattled. She was recalibrating. When she finally leaned forward, her voice was not louder. It was lower. Let me start by saying this. She said, eyes now fixed on the lens like a courtroom witness preparing her final statement. When a sitting president calls a member of Congress a lunatic on live air, we are no longer debating facts. We are debating whether truth is even allowed to finish its sentence. Tapper didn't move. Karoline watched silently. Crockett pressed on. I've been called worse, by better. I've been threatened in parking lots, followed out of courtrooms. I've held the hands of mothers whose sons were buried under the weight of systems that never called them by name. She exhaled through her nose, controlled. But this moment isn't about me. It's about the people the president is trying to distract you from. She placed her palm flat on the table again. Ava, the girl in the chair. Bernice, the woman with no heat. The veteran walking 6 miles to a benefits office that no longer exists. She leaned in. This is what happens when those in power can't discredit the facts. They try to discredit the person who carries them. The silence snapped back into place, taut and vibrating. Then Tapper turned. Miss Leavitt, the president has spoken. Would you like to respond? Karoline blinked once. Her shoulders lifted in a slow inhale. Then she sat straighter. What followed was not a defense. It was a redirect. I'm not here to justify the president's language, she said, her voice now carrying the weight of calibrated indignation. But I will explain the emotion behind it. Crockett tilted her head. Leavitt continued. For months now, this Congresswoman that Representative Crockett proudly represents has dragged this country through partisan subpoenas, baseless hearings, and political theatrics. Her tone sharpened. They've turned oversight into obsession. They've spent more time investigating Donald Trump than fixing broken cities, broken schools, and broken families. She turned finally squarely to Crockett. You speak of process. We speak of progress. While Congress prepares talking points, the president has secured our borders, rebuilt our trade policies, and put American interests back at the center. Tapper's fingers hovered above his notes, but he didn't move. Leavitt lowered her tone. You defend committees. We defend families. The sentence landed like a flag, clean, sharp, rhetorically sterile, politically potent. Then came the silence. Not awkward, just incomplete. Crockett didn't speak right away. She reached slowly, calmly toward her glass of water, sipped, replaced it, then leaned in not to retaliate, but to remove the mask. There's a funny thing she said about calling someone a performer while clapping for every scene. The line didn't spike, it sank, like a stone through clear water. She turned gently toward Leavitt. I sat in that chamber while your president walked in, under lights he chose with cameras placed for maximum reach, and read numbers not verified by any federal agency. Then walked out without taking a single question. Her voice didn't rise, it darkened. That's not governance, that's content. Karoline shifted. Crockett didn't blink. Your president doesn't engage with accountability. He stages around it, every quote calibrated for clips, every appearance edited for applause. Tapper remained frozen. And if you want to call that leadership, Crockett said, then don't be surprised when the only thing it leads to is chaos. The sentence sat for a beat. Then she added softer now. Congress is not a soundstage, but you've turned it into one. Karoline inhaled sharp. Crockett delivered the final blow, not with anger, but with clarity. You say you defend families. I say you defend a brand. She folded her hands again. And like any brand, the moment it loses control of the narrative, it lashes out. The camera zoomed in slightly. Tapper looked between them. The story wasn't a debate anymore. It was exposure, not through scandal, through stillness. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't scan the crowd for approval. She didn't lower her voice to manufacture intimacy. She simply stayed present, precise, and unbending. Karoline Leavitt sat across from her back. Straight breath held just slightly tighter than before. The room hadn't turned against her, but it had stopped echoing for her. The red live icon still glowed in the top corner of the screen, but the illusion that this was just another segment, just another night of political theater, had long since collapsed. Tapper leaned forward for the first time in nearly 20 minutes, not to moderate, but to mark the moment. We began tonight with numbers, but we seemed to be ending with something more difficult to measure. He looked at Crockett. Conviction, then to Leavitt, and consequence. The pause wasn't silence, it was permission. Karoline saw it and took it. She straightened once more, voice low now, tonally softer but politically sharpened. Congresswoman Crockett may speak in stories, but I speak for solutions. You say this administration is staging performance. But while you're reading letters, we're renegotiating trade deals. While you're quoting children, we're repatriating jobs. You talk about who suffers. I talk about who succeeds. Crockett didn't move. Her stillness had weight now. It wasn't passive. It was gravitational. Leavitt pressed on, clinging to tempo. We are not in the business of comfort. We are in the business of rebuilding. And if that makes some in Congress feel irrelevant, it's because progress doesn't wait for permission. She stopped short of a smile, but the subtext hovered. Tapper didn't respond. Crockett did. I'm not asking for comfort, she said evenly. I'm asking for honesty. She folded her hands. You say you're repatriating jobs, but at what cost? A 25% tariff on Canadian steel that crippled thousands of workers in Michigan and Ontario. A joke on live television suggesting Canada should become America's 51st state. Tapper blinked. Karoline did not. Crockett's tone hardened not in volume, but in definition. That's not diplomacy. That's imperial satire. The phrase landed like a dropped scalpel, clean, unexpected, surgical. Karoline tried to interject, but Crockett was already moving. You call it leadership, but it feels familiar. She leaned into the microphone, not for emphasis, but for incision. A man in robes, holding a staff, proclaiming himself ruler. That's not Lincoln. That's Jafar from Aladdin. Tapper looked down just once. Crockett continued each word Wade never wasted. I'm not here to defend Canada. I'm here to defend principle. Because if today we treat allies as applause lines, tomorrow we treat citizens as set pieces. She turned to the camera, voice lower, now almost reverent. And some of us don't have the luxury of being reduced without cost. Karoline's eyes tightened, her jaw clenched. Jasmine Crockett remained still. Jake Tapper let the silence sit for a full 7 seconds. Then he broke it. Tonight may be remembered not for what was said, but for what was revealed, he said slowly. The difference between a policy and a pitch, between a government and a brand. He turned slightly. Miss Leavitt, final word. Karoline's face reassembled itself, disciplined, composed, as though memory alone could reset the frame. She leaned in. Congresswoman Crockett has had a lot to say tonight, and she's clearly passionate. But I still believe in President Trump. She adjusted a paper she didn't need. I believe in a man who took on a system that was too slow, too soft, too tangled in red tape. I believe in results, and Americans across Texas, Ohio, Pennsylvania, they feel it. In jobs returned, in taxes cut, in trade deals signed. Her voice clicked into place. He isn't just a president, he's a comeback. Tapper didn't nod. He didn't blink. Crockett didn't react. Not yet. Karoline finished. And if some feel uncomfortable, maybe it's time we stop apologizing for defending America first. Crockett waited one beat, then exhaled through her nose, not as reaction, as clarity. She leaned forward. Canada, she repeated. The word sounded like a scalpel pulled slowly from its sheath. Then she turned to the camera. Let me tell you what actually happened. She didn't flinch. The President of the United States proposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, despite explicit warnings from the Department of Commerce and the Pentagon. She turned back to Karoline. That tariff didn't just inconvenience allies. It shattered manufacturing alliances, threatened thousands of jobs, and fractured the most peaceful trade relationship in this hemisphere. A pause, and then, on camera, with lights set and mic on, he joked that Canada should consider becoming our 51st state. She let the silence close around that image like a coffin lid. That's not patriotism. That's performance dressed in velvet tyranny. Karoline clenched her jaw. Her mouth didn't open. Crockett pressed forward, softer, slower. You call it strength, I call it satire. You call it leadership, I call it marketing. She looked directly at the camera. Because if a president starts treating sovereign nations like punchlines, then soon he will treat his own people like props. Tapper sat forward. And perhaps he said the question isn't how we lead the world, but whether we can still tell the difference between a country and a campaign. The camera began to pull back. The lights dimmed slightly, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She turned not to Karoline, not to Tapper, to the country. I don't post at 2 a.m. to demean women of color from the Oval Office. I don't go viral on Truth Social for tearing people down. I go silent when it matters, because truth doesn't need amplification. It needs arrival. She leaned closer to the lens, voice now, nearly a whisper, but clear enough to pierce every home it reached. You chose Elon Musk. A breath. I choose the law. The screen didn't fade, the silence didn't break, the credits didn't roll, they weren't needed, because America wasn't watching television anymore. It was watching itself.